And indeed, now I would like to show the quite interesting also slides by Monseigneur Vitillo. And Monseigneur Vitillo, you have the floor. Thank you very much. You are the last speaker, but I'm pretty sure you will say so interesting things.
Okay. Well, thank you, Michel. And Jesus said that the last will be first, so I'm honored to be last in amongst these speakers. As Pope Francis often reminds us, human trafficking is an open wound on the body of contemporary society. I'd like to thank you, Michel, for the privilege to join this webinar, which hopefully fortifies our own personal, community, national, regional, and global efforts to stop this terrible affront to human dignity and the sacredness of human life. I'd like to just very briefly introduce you to our organization, and I say our because Stefan is also our Chief Operating Officer, so we're both very honored to join you together tonight. The International Catholic Migration Commission was founded by Pope Pius XII in 1951, and I think we're getting the slide set confused again. I'll ask you when to advance it then when it's ready. He founded us at a time when there were still many stateless, homeless refugees in Europe, and we began our work first of all to resettle refugees from Europe to North America, within other European countries, and to Australia, and also to protect those who were more vulnerable to abuse. We probably didn't use the words human trafficking in those days, but certainly we needed to do a lot of protection, as Father Musi reminds us that we need to do that today as well. We have about 300 staff working to provide protection, humanitarian assistance, and capacity building to migrants and refugees in about 40 countries. Now, I was asked to do some analysis and recommendations, and I decided that I would take some of the testimonies that we have heard from people in different parts of the world and heard about their vulnerability to trafficking, and also to link that to some of what I see as root causes for the vulnerability to human trafficking. The first root cause that I would identify is extreme poverty and unequal access to enjoy God-given human rights and human dignity. And I don't need to tell you all of the statistics about poverty, but UNDP some time ago developed a multi-dimensional poverty index. So that defined poverty not just by income, but by a number of other indicators, including poor health, poor quality of work, and the threat of violence. And they found that it already involved about 1.3 billion people and under this criteria, and almost half of those were under 18 years of age, and 1/3 were under the age of 10 years. And speaking about different causes of human trafficking, Pope Francis calls our special attention to the first place of poverty, underdevelopment and exclusion, especially when combined with a lack of access to education or scarce, even non-existent employment opportunities. And so I'd like you to know, please go back to the slide, the other slide, please. Okay. I'd like you to meet then Francois, who was born in Côte d'Ivoire. And he understood the vulnerability to trafficking. And so he says, I know that things in Europe are better. There are different ways to immigrate. I would not go irregularly since I am afraid of that. I heard so many stories of persons who died of trafficking or so many dangers. I know that many people choose this way because their families need help and they are the only persons who could provide such help. Next slide, please. Okay, so The other major cause that I would see is the lack of birth registration and other important documents. This lack of documentations prevents access to vital services and often forces migrant and refugee children and adults to seek the services of smugglers and traffickers to reach their destinations, to be reunited with family members, or to accept indecent or exploitative work conditions. I'd like you to meet Sunita. She tells us, I am 35 years old, but I don't have any documents that attest to the date of my birth. 15 years ago, I migrated from Bangalore to Tamil Nadu with my sister. We bid farewell to our parents with the promise that we soon would be sending them some money. But things did not go as we had hoped, and my sister suicided. So I had to take over the care of her daughter. Next slide, please. And another issue is the fixation of business almost exclusively on amassing more money and profit easily leads to the commodification and exploitation of people, which in turn could result to vulnerability of poor and marginalized people to human trafficking. So I'd like you to meet Jean. And she's from Abidjan. After failing her bachelor's degree, she says, I decided to emigrate to Tunisia. When I arrived there, the family that offered me work took away my passport. They brought me to their house where I worked 5 months. I had to take care of the children and could never get rest, needed constantly to be available and never received my salary. They never allowed me to sign my contract, and they would not allow me to go to my country's embassy to register as a domestic worker. Next slide, please. Meet a group of fishermen from Côte d'Ivoire, and they receive help from the Stella Maris group in Abidjan, a Catholic organization that helps seafarers. They now are in Côte d'Ivoire, and their work conditions are very difficult, and they often face discrimination if they are migrants and not of the same nationality as the ship owner. Without regular documentation, it's impossible for them to obtain a license to fish. The Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development reports that more than 20.9 million people worldwide are considered the victims of forced labor. This type of labor is estimated to generate at least $150 billion per year of illegal profits in the private economy worldwide. Next slide, please. I'd like you to meet Rabia. She's a domestic worker in 3 different houses. She takes care of everything in these houses. I like my work. I am not part of any association. No one really invites me to become a member. My work is not recognized as true work because the government does not recognize a private home as a place of work. So it's difficult to identify who is my true employer and who is responsible to guarantee my rights as a worker. On such matters, there is total confusion at the government level. And so here we have to look at the demand side. Many times we see the problems of the workers, but we also have to know it's people demanding that work that perpetuates these situations. The UN rapporteur on trafficking in persons previously in a 2013 report to the UN Human Rights Council said demands for sexual exploitation, for cheap labor and domestic workers, for organ removal and sale, for illicit adoption and forced marriages, for criminal activities or begging, and for the exploitation for armed groups all constitute substantial contributing factors to human trafficking. Pope Francis is even more challenging. He said, certainly there is a lot of ignorance on the topic of trafficking, but sometimes there also seems to be a little will to understand the scope of the issue. Why? Because it touches close to our conscience, because it is thorny, because it is shameful. Then there are those who, even knowing this, do not want to speak because they are at the end of the supply chain as a user of the services that are offered on the street or on the internet. So I think we have to also look at this whole area. ICMC works to prevent human trafficking among the vulnerable group of refugees and migrants in irregular situations by providing job training that leads access to decent jobs or to starting their own small businesses, and by maintaining safe spaces for socialization and learning among women and child refugees who are survivors of sexual and/or gender-based violence. I don't want to conclude this without also putting us in the present context of the COVID-19 pandemic, because there we see an increase in the number of, in Jordan, we've done a study in our own program, we see a huge increase in early and forced marriages and in domestic abuse. So we have to also see that these special crises also make people more vulnerable and more willing then to risk their lives by putting themselves in the hands of smugglers and traffickers. Finally, I think we have to recognize that the issue involves everyone. And this is a good story that comes out of this. And I'd like you to introduce you to Juan and Maria, who now live in Chicago. They say, we crossed the Rio Grande and then in the desert. And when you live through that, you carry it with you for the rest of your life. Once you arrive here in Chicago, it's such a big shock. We learned thanks to our children. Their homework helped us to learn English. We are proud of who we are. We are migrants. We lived all kinds of challenges, and now we must help our community. We must build a network to help our brothers and sisters. We are involved in the group to offer pastoral care to migrants, and we would call it our second job. It is more important than our first job. Many migrants who arrive in the places of their destination are still very vulnerable to human trafficking and to abuse. And as Pope Francis reminds us, the issue involves everyone. It's not just about migrants, it's about all of us and what we can do and should do to prevent trafficking and to welcome, protect, promote, and integrate refugees and migrants throughout the world. Thank you very much.
And now I would like to ask two persons, possibly Monsignor Vitillo, and after that, Professor Moulali, if I may ask you to conclude. But Bob, may I ask you to add a few comments? Indeed, you have a lot to say. And Professor Moulali, I'm sure also you, not only as special rapporteur, but also as a teacher, you will be able to give us a conclusion of this very interesting webinar.
Well, I'll just say briefly, I think one thing that we haven't mentioned, and I didn't bring up either, are the internally displaced people, because many times they have much less protection even than the refugees and other migrants. So I think we need to consider their vulnerability to trafficking and to abuse, and they have often no place that they could protect them, because many times it's the very state that they're living in that's the source of the abuse. So that's another thing that I think we need to look at. Finally, I think, again, we need to learn from the people. We need to hear from them what the solutions are as well. And then we need to keep states responsible and accountable for the commitments they've made in international compacts and are not fulfilling. And I'm really very concerned that more and more states are not fulfilling even their obligations to the Geneva Convention, let alone the more recent compacts.
Thank you very much, Monsignor Vitillo. Indeed, thanks for mentioning IDPs, because as you know, IDPs are counted in millions, hundreds of millions. And actually, they are the forgotten people when we speak of refugees, when we speak of migrants, but we forget that there are so many IDPs and at times also IDPs without any identity and who are very vulnerable to trafficking.